It began long before the beaches of Normandy and the thunder of D-Day. The first and longest battle of the Second World War was not fought in the skies or on the fields of Europe, but in the endless, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. For Britain, the sea was life itself. Every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel, every bullet and bomb that sustained her came across the waves. Without those convoys, the island would starve, and Hitler knew it. When war broke out in September 1939, Germany unleashed its most dangerous weapon, the U-boat. These sleek steel predators slipped silently beneath the ocean's surface, their periscopes scanning the horizon for targets. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun, a shadow war that would last 6 long years and cost the lives of over 70,000 sailors and airmen. The Atlantic was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard. In those early months, Britain's merchant ships sailed almost unprotected. The Royal Navy, still adapting to modern submarine warfare, underestimated the U-boat threat. Convoys were disorganized, escorts too few, and radar technology primitive. German submarines struck with deadly precision, torpedoes ripping through hulls in the black of night. Ships burned, cargo sank, and men vanished beneath freezing waters before rescue could reach them. Winston Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister, would later call it the only thing that truly frightened him, the U-boat peril. For if the Atlantic was lost, Britain would fall. Without food, fuel, or the means to fight, the island fortress would be strangled into submission. Every convoy that sailed west to east became a roll of the dice against the abyss. By the end of 1940, the situation was desperate. The U-boat Wolfpacks, operating in coordinated groups, were tearing through Allied shipping lanes with terrifying efficiency. The British Admiralty faced a grim truth. Survival depended not only on courage but on technology, intelligence, and the sheer will to endure a war fought out of sight, beneath the waves. The U-boat war was the creation of Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man who understood that submarines could win what traditional fleets could not. His strategy was elegant and merciless. Attack in numbers at night and overwhelm the convoy escorts. A single wolf might fail, but a pack could devour a convoy whole. And so, under the black canopy of the Atlantic night, the Wolfpacks hunted. Each U-boat was a claustrophobic world of 50 men packed into narrow steel tubes that reeked of diesel, sweat, and fear. Patrols could last for weeks, sometimes months. The air was heavy, the temperature unbearable, and every dive was a gamble with death. Yet these men were young, determined, and skilled, the elite of the Kriegsmarine. Their prey, the slow, lumbering merchant ships that carried Britain's lifeline. The attacks were swift and terrifying. A torpedo would strike, a column of fire would erupt into the night, and within seconds the convoy scattered. Panic was the U-boat's ally. Radio chatter filled the air as escorts struggled to locate the unseen enemy. Depth charges rumbled through the deep, but the hunters were already gone, slipping silently away to reload and strike again. By 1941, the toll was staggering. Hundreds of ships had been lost. Entire convoys vanished without a trace. German radio broadcasts boasted of Britain's coming starvation. Londoners queued for rationed bread and wondered how long their island could endure. Even the Americans, not yet in the war, watched with growing alarm as the Atlantic burned. But the Wolfpacks had underestimated something: the resilience of their prey. Britain would not surrender the sea. New tactics, new weapons, and a growing alliance with American industry and intelligence would soon turn the tide. The invisible war beneath the waves was about to evolve into something far more complex, a struggle of machines, minds, and endurance. By late 1941, the Allies were learning. The chaos of the early convoys gave way to discipline and coordination. Escort groups were formed, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates bristling with sonar and depth charges. These men became the guardians of the sea lanes, their lives tied to the fragile ships they defended. The ocean was vast, but their duty was clear: protect the convoy at all costs. Radar and sonar began to change everything. Once blind in the dark, Allied ships could now detect faint echoes of submerged submarines. Aircraft patrols stretched farther from shore, armed with depth bombs and searchlights. Slowly, painfully, the hunters were becoming the hunted. Every successful U-boat attack came at an increasing price. Then came America's entry into the war in December 1941. The Atlantic became a global front. The U-boats expanded their operations, striking even along the American coastline, where unprepared merchant ships sailed lit up against city skylines. It was a massacre, what the Germans called the Second Happy Time. Yet it would not last. The Americans, learning fast, adopted Britain's convoy system, tightened coastal security, and brought industrial might to the ocean war. In the cold expanse between Newfoundland and Iceland, British and Canadian escorts fought endless battles with wolfpacks, often in storms so fierce that ships vanished beneath waves taller than houses. It was a brutal, grinding war of endurance. Victories were rarely celebrated, for each success was measured against the countless names already lost to the deep. But something was shifting. The Allies were developing new technologies: high-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff, long-range patrol aircraft, and cryptographic breakthroughs that would soon give them the edge. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering a new phase, one where intelligence would prove as deadly as torpedoes. In the silent rooms of Bletchley Park, far from the roar of the Atlantic, another kind of war was being fought, a war of intellect and secrecy. Here, mathematicians, linguists, and cryptographers worked tirelessly to pierce the heart of German communication. The Enigma code. Every U-boat received its orders through encrypted messages, and whoever could read those signals would know where the wolves would strike before they struck. Among the quiet heroes of this invisible war was Alan Turing, a brilliant mathematician whose mind worked like a machine itself. Alongside a team of codebreakers, Turing designed a device capable of testing millions of possible Enigma settings until the correct one was found: the Bombe. Every day, Enigma's codes changed. Every day, the team raced against time to break them anew. Failure meant convoys lost and thousands dead. Success meant lives saved. But the enemy could never know their secrets were compromised. By mid-1941, their efforts began to bear fruit. Ultra-intelligence, the highest level of classified information, flowed from Bletchley Park to the Admiralty. The Allies could now reroute convoys away from danger zones and track U-boat wolfpacks as they maneuvered in the vast Atlantic. It was as if a blindfold had been lifted. The submarines that once struck from the dark were suddenly being met by escorts ready and waiting. Yet the fight remained delicate. If the Germans suspected their code was broken, they would change it entirely. So the Allies had to use their knowledge sparingly, allowing some convoys to be attacked so the secret could remain hidden. It was a cruel arithmetic of war, sacrificing a few to save many. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz began to notice something unsettling. His U-boats were dying in greater numbers, ambushed in areas they believed were safe. He suspected leaks, but never guessed that the Allies were listening to his every word. The wolves were still hunting, but the prey was beginning to see in the dark. The year 1943 would mark the turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies, now armed with intelligence, technology, and sheer production power, began to fight with precision and ferocity. New escort carriers brought aircraft to the mid-Atlantic, the deadly Black Pit, where no air cover had previously reached. The hunters of the sky joined the war beneath the waves. Long-range Liberator bombers, fitted with radar and powerful spotlights, hunted U-boats on the surface as they surfaced to recharge their batteries. Suddenly, the deep ocean was no longer a safe refuge. At night, radar picked up faint traces of periscopes and conning towers. In daylight, sonar painted targets below the waves. Each technological step was another nail in the coffin of Dönitz's fleet. Meanwhile, Allied shipyards, powered by American industry, were producing Liberty ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. What had once taken months now took days. The United States was turning out new ships like a machine, unstoppable and relentless. For every vessel lost, 3 more took its place. The German submariners began to realize a grim truth. No matter how many they sank, The sea lanes never ran dry. In April and May of 1943, the Wolfpacks launched one final massive assault on the North Atlantic convoys. They expected an easy kill. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated storm of depth charges, radar-guided bombers, and well-drilled escorts that seemed to anticipate their every move. In those months alone, the Kriegsmarine lost over 40 U-boats, more than a third of its active fleet. For the first time, Dönitz ordered a retreat. The Atlantic, once a killing ground for his submarines, had become their graveyard. It was a strategic collapse, a moment when Germany's dream of starving Britain to submission drowned beneath the waves it had once ruled. Victory in the Atlantic did not come cheaply. It was bought with courage, endurance, and sacrifice from men who fought in conditions few could imagine. Merchant sailors faced nights lit by fire and mornings of silence, watching the sea for periscopes that could mean death. Their ships were slow, their defenses few, yet they kept sailing. Without them, the armies in Africa, the factories in Britain, and the hopes of the free world would have withered. In the escort ships, young sailors, many barely out of their teens, lived in a perpetual storm. They battled not only the enemy but the ocean itself. The cold cut through their clothes. The salt burned their faces raw. When depth charges went off, the entire ship shook as if struck by thunder. They cheered when a U-boat was sunk, but few ever saw their enemies' faces. War beneath the waves was faceless, fought between echoes and blips on a sonar screen. For the German submariners, the war turned from triumph to torment. Life aboard a U-boat became a slow death. With every patrol, the odds of survival shrank. By the end of the war, nearly 30,000 German submariners, 3/4 of all who served, were dead. Many went down without even a trace, their steel coffins lying silently on the ocean floor. When the battle was finally won, Churchill called it the longest, hardest, and most bitterly fought campaign of the war. Without victory in the Atlantic, D-Day could never have happened. No tanks, no fuel, no food could have reached Europe's shores. The men who fought in that cold, gray world beneath the waves ensured that freedom itself stayed alive. And yet their story would remain largely untold, hidden beneath the roar of grander victories. The Battle of the Atlantic was not about glory or conquest. It was about endurance. A silent war where victory meant survival, and survival meant everything. By mid-1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz sat in his underground command bunker near Berlin, staring at a map littered with tiny red pins, each representing a lost submarine. The once mighty Wolfpacks that had terrorized Allied convoys were now dwindling faster than he could replace them. His U-boat captains, once the hunters of the Atlantic, were becoming the hunted. But Dönitz was a man driven by obsession. To him, the U-boat was Germany's last great weapon, the only tool capable of bringing Britain to its knees. Even as losses mounted, he refused to surrender the depths. "If we can cut their arteries," he told his staff, "the British body will die." And so, he gambled on new machines, the advanced Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design that could stay submerged far longer than any before it. Faster underwater than on the surface. It was meant to be the miracle weapon that would turn the tide once again. In shipyards scattered across Germany, construction began in secret. But Allied bombers were watching. Day after day, precision strikes shattered factories, sank half-built hulls, and buried crews under rubble. Dönitz's new fleet was born too late. By the time the first of these submarines entered the war, the Allies had already choked the Atlantic with radar, sonar, and long-range patrols. Still, his crews sailed. They went out knowing the odds, their faces drawn and pale as they slipped into the black waters. Many never came back. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard, vast and merciless. And yet, to the last, Dönitz kept sending them, hoping against hope that one lucky strike might turn despair into victory. It never came. By early 1944, he knew it was over. Germany's U-boat arm, once his pride and his dream, was dying one steel coffin at a time. The wolves had been hunted to extinction. While Dönitz's empire beneath the waves crumbled, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible: control of the Atlantic. It was not just a military victory. It was an industrial and logistical triumph that stretched across continents. The ocean, once ruled by fear, now carried the steady pulse of life and war supplies. In Britain, the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow roared with activity. Ships arrived in endless lines, their hulls filled with American food, fuel, and weapons. Convoys moved with almost mechanical precision, protected by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that kept watch day and night. Above them, the sky was no longer empty. Allied air patrols, armed with radar and depth charges, scoured the waves. Even at night, with the help of Lee lights, powerful spotlights mounted on aircraft, U-boats caught on the surface were trapped like deer in headlights, their doom swift and certain. What had once been a desperate defense became a confident offensive. The Royal Navy, supported by the U.S. Navy, launched hunter-killer groups, fleets whose sole purpose was to find and destroy submarines. With intelligence from Bletchley Park and the coordination of air and sea power, these groups hunted with surgical efficiency. For the first time, the Allies dictated the rhythm of the war beneath the waves. The ocean, which had once belonged to the Wolfpacks, now echoed with the sound of Allied engines, Liberty ships and tankers crossing in endless succession. This control meant more than victory at sea. It meant life for the nations fighting tyranny. Without the Atlantic lifeline, the Normandy invasion would have been unthinkable. The road to D-Day began not on the beaches of France, but in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where courage and endurance prevailed over fear and despair. By 1945, the end had come, though few dared say it aloud. In the U-boat pens at Kiel and Hamburg, crews gathered for one last mission, their faces hardened by years of loss. They knew what awaited them. The Allied patrols were everywhere, the skies thick with bombers, the sea filled with destroyers. Every voyage was a gamble with death. For these men, service aboard a U-boat was a mixture of pride and terror. They lived in steel tubes that smelled of oil and sweat, crammed shoulder to shoulder, surviving on stale bread and canned meat. The air grew foul within hours of diving. The temperature dropped. Condensation dripped from every surface. Sleep came in shifts, food in rations, and fear was their constant companion. Still, they went. Some out of duty, some out of loyalty, and some because there was nowhere else to go. They wrote letters to mothers, wives, and sweethearts that would never be mailed. They pressed Lucky Charms into their pockets and sailed into the dark. Most would never return. The ocean floor became their resting place, cold, silent, eternal. Hundreds of U-boats lay scattered across the seabed from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, each one a tomb of iron. Historians would later call it one of the most tragic losses in military history. 28,000 men of the U-boat service, nearly 3 out of every 4 who served, gone without a trace. When the war finally ended, Dönitz, now Führer for a brief and desperate moment after Hitler's death, surrendered his broken fleet. The dream of strangling Britain's supply lines had failed. The Atlantic had not yielded to the Wolfpacks. It had swallowed them whole. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic had become a highway of hope. What had once been a perilous gauntlet of U-boats and storm-tossed waters now thrummed with life and purpose. Convoys stretched beyond the horizon. Endless columns of Liberty ships, tankers, and troop transports, their wakes gleaming like silver threads in the morning sun. Each vessel carried a heartbeat of the Allied war machine. Inside, their holds lay everything a global army needed. Fuel drums stacked like pillars. Crates of canned food marked U.S. Army, jeeps and trucks lashed in neat rows, aircraft engines crated in oil paper wrapping, and above all, men. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers bound for the battlefields of Europe. It was an astonishing sight. Each convoy was guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft that patrolled in unison, forming a living wall of steel and vigilance. Radar screens glowed in the darkness, sonar pings echoed through the deep, and voices whispered through radio static as commanders guided the flotilla across the treacherous sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer about survival. It was about dominance. The Allies had turned the tide. They had mastered the mathematics of logistics, marrying technology with courage, production with precision. For the first time since the war began, Churchill could look upon the sea and see not peril, but promise. "The lifeline is safe," he wrote in his notes that spring. "Britain will live." What followed was the greatest movement of men and machines in human history, a logistical miracle made possible only because the Atlantic had been won. June 1944. The gray waters of the English Channel were alive with motion. Hundreds of ships, landing craft, destroyers, transports, and battleships gathered in tight formations, their decks crowded with soldiers clutching rifles and staring into the mist. The D-Day invasion, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, was about to unfold. Yet behind that moment of glory lay years of struggle beneath the waves. Without the victory in the Atlantic, this invasion would have been impossible. Every tank, every aircraft, every bullet that crossed into Normandy had first crossed the Atlantic. The sea had carried the weight of liberation. Long before boots touched French sand, the men who manned the convoy escorts, the sailors who braved endless nights of fear, were not there to witness the beaches of Normandy. Many of them were still at sea, scanning the horizon for submarines that no longer came. But their victory was written into every landing craft that churned toward Omaha, Utah, and Juneau. As the first Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, the ghosts of the Atlantic War lingered beneath the waves. The wrecks of merchant ships, the shattered hulls of U-boats, the silent graves of those who had died ensuring this moment could happen. The Battle of the Atlantic had not been won in a single clash but in 10,000 unseen battles fought in the cold and the dark. And now, that invisible war had given birth to daylight. Long after the guns fell silent, the men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic faded quietly into history. There were no grand parades for the sailors who spent years staring at gray horizons or listening to the echo of sonar pings. There were no monuments for the radio operators who died sending out distress calls, or for the merchant seamen who froze to death in lifeboats adrift in the North Atlantic's cruel waters. Yet, without them, victory would have been a dream. The war was not won only by generals and politicians, but by ordinary men who endured endless monotony punctuated by moments of terror. Sailors who faced the sea, the enemy, and their own fear. Night after night, in Liverpool and Halifax, in Boston and Belfast, mothers and wives waited for letters that never came. Ships vanished without trace, torpedoed, burned, or simply swallowed by the ocean. Some families waited for years, never knowing how or where their loved ones had perished. For them, the Atlantic would always remain a place of both victory and loss, the grave and the cradle of freedom. Historians would later call it the longest continuous battle of the Second World War. But for the men who lived it, it was simply life, a duty carried out in silence. Their bravery did not roar like the guns of Normandy. It whispered through the waves. By the final months of 1945, the Atlantic was quiet again, eerily so. The howling storm of torpedoes, depth charges, and sirens had given way to still waters and drifting wreckage. What few German submarines remained were fleeing westward, their captains desperately searching for ports that no longer welcomed them. In May, as Hitler's Reich crumbled, Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to cease hostilities and surrender. Across the ocean, the remnants of his once feared fleet surfaced, ghostly silhouettes emerging from the gray waves, their black crosses replaced by white flags. British destroyers circled them cautiously, their crews silent, aware they were witnessing the end of an era. Some U-boat captains wept as they climbed onto Allied decks, realizing they had survived what so many of their comrades had not. For them, the surrender was not just military defeat, it was the end of a brotherhood forged in steel and salt water, and the acknowledgement that the empire they had fought for had perished beneath the waves. When the Allies began scuttling the captured submarines, the sea that had consumed so many men now swallowed the machines themselves. Hundreds of U-boats were deliberately sunk in Operation Deadlight. their hulls slipping beneath the Atlantic one by one. It was both a cleansing and a burial, a symbolic gesture that the wolves of the sea would never hunt again. The Battle of the Atlantic was finally over, but its ghosts would remain, resting silently on the seabed, where the light of day could never reach. For Winston Churchill, the victory at sea held a personal meaning few others could understand. Years later, when reflecting on the entire war, he admitted, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, that the only thing that ever truly frightened him was the U-boat peril. He had lived with it every day. He had studied convoy reports at 3 a.m., his desk covered in maps and casualty lists, the faint hum of typewriters echoing through the war rooms. Each red mark on those charts represented not just a ship, but hundreds of lives and the fate of his island nation. When the war ended, Churchill ordered that the sailors of the Merchant Navy and Royal Navy be honored alongside the soldiers who fought on land. In speeches, he described them as the bravest of the brave, men who fought not for glory or medals, but for the right of others to fight another day. In 1946, he visited Liverpool, the heart of the convoy effort, and stood silently as ship's bells tolled for the lost. Around him, dock workers, widows, and veterans bowed their heads. The cold sea wind carried the faint scent of salt and smoke. Churchill removed his hat, his eyes glistening, and said softly to those nearby, "This was our longest vigil, and we endured." That moment captured the essence of Britain's wartime soul, not triumph in battle, but endurance through suffering. When historians look back on the Second World War, they often focus on the thunder of tanks in Normandy or the bombs over Berlin. Yet the war's beating heart was the sea. The Atlantic was not just a battleground. It was the bridge that held the Allies together, the artery through which flowed every ship, every ration, every hope. Without victory in the Atlantic, there would have been no D-Day, no liberation of France, no final march into Germany. It was the ocean, vast, cold, merciless, that carried freedom upon its waves. Today, rusting wrecks lie scattered across the seafloor, silent reminders of the price paid for that freedom. In the stillness of the deep, you can almost imagine the faint echo of engines, the ghostly ping of sonar, and the whispered prayers of sailors who never came home. Every year, wreaths are cast into the waters where the convoys once sailed. The flowers float briefly, then sink, joining those who sleep beneath. It is a quiet tribute to the men who fought an invisible war, whose courage was measured not in victories, but in endurance. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a military campaign. It was a testament to human resilience, proof that even in the darkest depths, light can prevail, and in the endless rhythm of the waves, the story of their sacrifice still endures.